Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson. We're continuing our series called Recommended Reading, and today I'd like to recommend to you the book of Ecclesiastes, but read in a certain way. We love this book. I don't know anybody who says, I hate the book of Ecclesiastes. There are so many passages in it that just call to us, and yet it is so bleak, so dark, so disappointed, so honest about the human condition, and yet also honest about God. Let's see it for what it is. It's an experiment. It's an experiment. There's a question asked. Someone asks a question and then uses their life to investigate the answer to that question. And then the answer is given. And the question is this: chapter 1, verse 3. What is it advantageous, or what advantage does a man have in all his work which he does under the sun? What can we do under the sun that makes a difference, that brings about goodness? What are we supposed to do in our life under the sun? Now, in limiting his question to under the sun, he has removed from the equation eternity. And therefore, there can be no um, um, fleeing to the great by and by. There can be no. We'll get paid later on. We've got heaven to look forward to. He's taken that completely out of the question. If all we have is the human life that we have now, our mortal life, if when we die, we're dead, and that's the end of everything, what should we be doing on this earth? And of course, that's why it is so bleak, because that's a tough question. And he does not permit us to think about um, eternity until the end, when eternity comes back, except for that passage in chapter 3, where he admits to himself and to all the rest of us that we can't stop thinking about eternity. And we'll look at that in just a second. Who wrote the book? Solomon. Who else? I mean, it's not fashionable to say Solomon, but when he describes himself in chapter 2, someone who has unlimited resources, someone who has unlimited power, and someone who has not only the knowledge but the wisdom to um, to interpret his findings. Um, who else could it be? We don't know anyone else from human history, certainly not from the Bible, that would fit this description except Solomon. And of course, we know from the historical record how Solomon's life was at some point became spent in the dissipation of having 300 700 wives and 300 concubines, and allowing these wives to pursue their idolatrous practices right in the city or right outside the city of Jerusalem. We know all these things. We know about his excess. We know about the high taxes he brought upon the people. We know because the Bible tells us these things. And so, who else would it be but Solomon? And of course, if you are this wise and you've been given a life and been given those resources and you've largely wasted it, you would, feel that way. Solomon doesn't say anything in this book that isn't true, really. There's the one line that's kind of hard to deal with, chapter 7, verse 28, where Solomon says, I've looked through 1,000 people. I've only found one good man, but no good woman in 1,000. Well, that's not a random number, because Solomon had 1,000 wives and concubines. And the great teacher Jack P. Lewis said in his introduction to the Old Testament class on Ecclesiastes, if Solomon had only been looking for one woman, he would have found that one woman. And I believe that's true. And I believe we see that longing for the wife of your youth, for the one woman that you build a life with throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes says, what should we be doing? And it only has to be 4 verses long, because the conclusion, when everything is heard, is fear God and keep his commandments. This applies to everybody. And then we have eternity come back in at the end of chapter 12, because God will bring every act into judgment. All of us are going to have to face an eternity somewhere. But the answer is the same, whether you take eternity out of the equation or not. It's fear God, honor God, and keep his commandments. That's what we should be doing. But along the way, We go down so many dead end streets, and just fall into so many pits of quicksand with him, looking at the way the world is, and it ought not be, and yet the language is so beautiful. I want to give you an example of how there's almost a despairing tone in the language, but it's so pretty that we come to it anyway. And just the beauty of it gives us comfort. And it's a passage we all know in chapter 3, beginning with verse 1. There is an appointed time for everything, a time for every event, every purpose under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones together for like building, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, time to search and a time to give up as lost, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent, a time to speak, a time to love, a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What profit is there to the worker from all in which he toils? It really is talking about being on a loop that you can't get off of. And yet, the language, which is so simply communicated, is just so bare bones and simple in its design, in the quotidian things it describes for much of it. And yet, it's so pretty. It's so beautiful, not just in Hebrew, but in any language. And we take comfort from this because it's God's word. It's God's word, and it's so wise and beautiful, and we take comfort from this. I want us to look at just a few verses ahead. In verse 11, this is where he mentions eternity again. God has made everything appropriate in its time, referring to the poem that we just read. He also set eternity in their hearts, so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. We are on this wheel, we're on this loop, and of ourselves we can't get off of it. But in our hearts, we know there's something else that we cannot have by ourselves, something else that is God's, that without God we cannot have. God has set eternity in our hearts. The thing about this is that along the way, he starts to make he understands some things. And the main thing is that the best that we can have out of life is to have some honest occupation, some work, and someone with whom to enjoy our life, and then to rest, to have honest rest at the end of the day. Chapter 4, verses 9 through 12. Well, no. Let's start with chapter 2, verses 24 through 26. There is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and say to himself that his labor is good. This I have also seen is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? So there's the occupation. And then there's the person to share it with. Chapter 4, verse 9. Two are better than one, because they have good return for their labor. But if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. Woe to him who falls where there is not another to lift him up. If two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands are not quickly torn apart. These observations are repeated throughout. I want to look at what he says in chapter 9, beginning with verse 7. Go then, eat your bread in happiness, drink your wine with a cheerful heart. God has already approved of your works. Let your clothes be white all the time, and don't let oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the woman whom you love, singular, woman whom you love all the days of your fleeting life, which he has given you under the sun. This is your gift in life, and in your toil which you have labored under the sun. And whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for there is no activity or planning or wisdom in the grave where you're going. Even if there's no heaven, we've been given a gift. It's a gift of life on earth. And the things that we have on earth that are given to us as a gift are those things God gave us in Eden. What do we have in Eden? We had this life on this planet that God made for us with things to eat and drink and enjoy. What do we have? We had occupation to dress and keep the garden. What did we have? We had someone to share it with. Even if we don't have eternity, God has given us gift on this planet. Even if all we have is just under the sun, we the gifts that we have, the things that are of true value, the things that God has given to us are the things that God gave to us in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. The abundance of this wonderful planet God has given to us, this garden in the middle of all the universe, something for us to do that's meaningful, that we can put all of our effort into, work, labor that's meaningful, and someone to share that life with. And don't we also hear longing in his voice for the one woman that he doesn't have because he has 1,000? And for simple labor and honest sleep. But he doesn't have any of those things because he's a king. Oh, well. I love the book of Ecclesiastes. You do too. And I'd like to thank you for listening to me in what is now the longest of the 5 good minutes. Next time, we're going to talk about Song of Solomon. Thank you for joining me.